They say the mountains don't keep secrets. They just bury them under rock and silence. For Caleb Thorne, a man running from ghosts, that silence was a sanctuary. But one blistering afternoon, the Arizona winds brought him more than just dust and regret. It brought him 2 Apache children clinging to life by a thread. He did what any man with a shred of a soul would do. He saved them. But in the Wild West, no good deed goes unpunished, because the very next morning, their mother appeared at his door. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She was carrying a gift that would unravel a secret so profound it threatened to paint the canyons red with blood, forcing a forgotten man to face the very demons he'd spent years trying to bury. The sun over the Dragoon Mountains was a merciless molten coin hammered flat against a turquoise sky. It bleached the color from the granite and baked the very life from the sparse vegetation clinging to the slopes. For Caleb Thorne, this brutal, beautiful landscape was home. It was a fortress of solitude built from jagged peaks and whispering pines, a place where a man's past could be worn down to grit, just like the mountains themselves. His cabin, tucked into a fold of the land near a seasonal creek, was a testament to his desire for isolation. Hewn from timber, he'd felled himself with a stone chimney that breathed a lazy plume of smoke into the morning air. It was more a part of the mountain than a structure built upon it. Caleb was not a young man, but time had shaped him rather than broken him. His face was a roadmap of harsh sun and harder memories, with lines etched deep around eyes the color of a faded sky. His beard, thick and streaked with grey, hid a jaw that was perpetually set, as if bracing for a blow that had fallen years ago and might yet fall again. He moved with the quiet, deliberate economy of a predator, a man who had learned the language of silence from the animals he shared the wilderness with. He'd once been a scout, his eyes reading the land for the U.S. Army, but he'd seen too much of what men did to one another in the name of progress, and had long since traded his cavalry patch for the quiet company of the peaks. That afternoon, he was checking his trap lines along the sun-scorched bed of Whisper Creek, a name that felt like a cruel joke in the oppressive heat. The air was so still he could hear the buzz of a fly 50 yards away. It was this unnatural quiet that first set him on edge. The usual chatter of jays was absent. The rustle of lizards in the undergrowth was gone. It was a listening silence, the kind that precedes either a storm or a death. His hand rested instinctively on the worn stock of the Winchester rifle, cradled in his arm. He followed the creek bed, his worn leather boots making no sound on the smooth, sun-warmed stones. Rounding a sharp bend where a cluster of resilient sycamores offered a meager patch of shade, he stopped dead. The smell hit him first, the coppery tang of old blood mixed with the acrid scent of fear. Then he saw them. 2 figures, small and still, lay half hidden in the shade. They were Apache children, girls dressed in tattered buckskin dresses that were stiff with grime and something darker. The elder, perhaps 14, was curled protectively around the younger, who couldn't have been more than 8. Their black hair was matted with dirt, and leaves their faces smudged with tears and streaked with dust. The older girl's arm was wrapped in a crude, blood-soaked bandage, and the younger one's breathing was a shallow, rasping sound that was barely audible. Their lips were cracked and grey, their skin pulled taut over delicate bones. They were perilously close to the edge. Caleb's first instinct was caution, a reflex drilled into him by years of survival. He scanned the ridge lines, his eyes missing nothing. A displaced stone, a broken branch, any sign of who had left them here. Were they bait? Was this a trap the renegade bands, pushed to desperation, were known for their cunning? But as he watched, the younger girl let out a tiny, piteous whimper, a sound so utterly devoid of hope it cut through his hardened exterior like a hot knife. He lowered his rifle, the caution in his eyes replaced by a grim resolve. He knelt beside them, the stones digging into his knees. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice a low rumble unused to speech. The older girl's eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they held a spark of fierce defiance. She tried to push the younger girl further behind her, a mother bear protecting her cub even in her last moments. "I'm not going to hurt you," Caleb said, keeping his voice soft. He unslung his canteen, the slosh of water, a sound of life in the dead air. He uncorked it and held it out. The girl stared at the canteen, then at him, her gaze a mixture of desperate thirst and profound mistrust. He was a white man, Undi Bayou the enemy. Her entire life had taught her to fear him. Caleb understood the look. He'd seen it before. He didn't push. He simply set the canteen on the ground between them, then slowly backed away, a few paces, sitting on his haunches. He remained still, a patient mountain cat, letting them see he was no immediate threat. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun beat down. Finally, the primal need for water won out. The older girl, with a trembling hand, reached for the canteen. She took a small sip, then another, before painstakingly dribbling a few precious drops onto the lips of her little sister. Seeing this, Caleb knew he had to act. They wouldn't survive another night here. The sun would finish what their pursuers had started, and if not the sun, then the coyotes. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I have a cabin," he said, pointing up the canyon. "Water, food, medicine." The girl's eyes followed his finger, her face a mask of suspicion. He saw the calculation within them, a chance of survival, with a potential enemy versus certain death in the canyon. He could see the moment she made her choice. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Getting them back to his cabin was a trial. The younger girl was barely conscious, and he had to carry her. She was as light as a bundle of dry sticks, her small head lolling against his shoulder. The older girl, whose name he would later learn, was Nita, insisted on walking, though she swayed with every step, her pride, a fragile shield against her exhaustion. She kept her eyes fixed on him, watching his every move, her hand never far from the small knife tucked into her belt. Caleb didn't mind. He respected it. In this land, trust was a luxury, and suspicion was a tool of survival. He carried the small girl Shimmer into the cool, dim interior of his cabin and laid her gently on his own cot. Nita stood in the doorway, hesitating as if crossing the threshold was a final surrender. Caleb ignored her for a moment, moving to the hearth where a pot of water was always kept warm. He ladled some into a cup, found a clean rag, and began to gently clean the grime from the younger girl's face. His hands, usually occupied with skinning game or splitting wood, were surprisingly gentle. He tended to Nita's arm next, cutting away the filthy bandage. The wound beneath was a nasty gash, inflamed and angry. As he cleaned it with carbolic soap and water, she hissed in pain, but didn't cry out. She watched his face, searching for any hint of malice, but found only a quiet, focused concentration. He worked in silence, applying a salve of his own, making a mixture of yarrow and comfrey root before binding the arm with clean linen. For the next several hours he worked to save them. He coaxed broth and water down their throats. He sat by the younger girl's cot, placing cool, damp cloths on her fevered brow. Nita sat in a chair by the hearth, a wool blanket draped over her shoulders, her dark eyes tracking his every move. She said nothing. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside, and the faint, ragged breathing of the child on the cot. As twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Caleb looked at the two sisters, their presence a profound disruption to his ordered solitude. He had invited the world back into his fortress, and he had a sinking feeling that the silence he had so carefully cultivated was about to be shattered for good. The first light of dawn speared through the single window of the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Caleb had not slept. He had spent the night in his rocking chair, by the cooling embers of the fire, his Winchester, across his lap, alternating between watching the sleeping girls and the dark maw of the doorway. Old habits died hard. A part of him still expected the brutal violence that had driven them here to follow them to his door. The younger girl Shimmer had broken her fever near midnight. Her breathing was deeper now, more regular. In her sleep, she looked impossibly small and fragile against the coarse wool of his blankets. The older one, Nita, had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her head slumped against the back of the wooden chair she refused to leave. Even in sleep, her hand rested on the hilt of her knife. Caleb rose his joints, protesting, and moved silently to rekindle the fire. He put a pot of coffee on to brew and sliced off a piece of bacon from a slab hanging from the rafters. The familiar rituals were a comforter way to impose order on a situation that was anything but. The smell of coffee and frying bacon began to fill the small space. It was the scent of a new day of life. Nita stirred first. Her eyes snapped open instantly, alert, the fear and suspicion of the previous day flooding back in. She saw Caleb by the fire, his back to her, and for a moment her body tensed, ready to fight or flee. But the domestic scene, the gentle crackle of the fire, the homely aroma of breakfast seemed to disarm her. She watched as he poured coffee into a tin mug, then turned and offered it to her. She stared at the mug, then at his face. She saw the exhaustion etched there, the deep-set weariness in his eyes. He hadn't harmed them during the night. He had cared for them. A flicker of something other than fear crossed her face, a hesitant curiosity. She took the mug, her small hands wrapping around its warmth. She did not drink, but she held it. It was a start. "Your sister is better," Caleb said, his voice a low gravel. "The fever is gone." Nita's gaze shot to the cot. She saw the gentle rise and fall of Shima's chest, and a visible wave of relief washed over her, softening the hard lines of her face. She slid off her chair and padded silently to the bedside, placing a hand on her sister's forehead. The skin was cool. Tears welled in Nita's eyes, the first sign of vulnerability she had shown. She quickly brushed them away, her back rigid once more. Caleb placed a plate with a piece of bacon and a small corn cake on the table. "Eat," he commanded gently. "You need your strength." This time she obeyed without hesitation. She ate quickly, ravenously, like a starving wolf, her eyes still darting around the cabin, taking in the details, the neatly stacked firewood, the clean-swept floor, the collection of worn books on a small shelf, the lack of any personal effects, save for a single faded tintype on the mantelpiece of a woman he never looked at. Just as the sun cleared the highest peak, casting long shadows across the canyon, a sound made Caleb freeze. It was the soft scuff of a moccasin on stone just outside the cabin. It was a sound he was trained to hear, but this one was different. It wasn't the furtive sound of a scout or the aggressive tread of a warrior. It was deliberate calm and utterly confident. Nita heard it too. Her head shot up, her eyes wide, with a mixture of hope and fear. Caleb motioned for her to stay quiet, grabbing his rifle and moving to the side of the door. He peered through a small crack in the chinking. A lone figure stood 20 yards from the cabin, bathed in the golden morning light. It was a woman. She was tall and slender, with a presence that seemed to command the very air around her. Her face was a mask of stoic dignity, her features sharp and intelligent, her high cheekbones speaking of a proud lineage. Her black hair, woven with threads of silver, was tied back in a single thick braid. She wore a simple but well-made buckskin dress adorned with intricate quill work. She held no weapon. She simply stood there watching the cabin, her dark, penetrating eyes seeming to see right through the thick log walls. Caleb knew instantly who she was. She had the same fierce pride as Nita, the same deep-set, intelligent eyes. This was their mother. He lowered his rifle and opened the door, stepping out into the light. He stood on the small porch, his hands held open and away from his body to show he was unarmed. The woman's gaze shifted to him. It was an unnerving look, an appraisal that stripped away his rough exterior and seemed to peer directly into his soul. She was looking for weakness, for deceit, for the rot that she had come to expect from his kind. "They are inside," Caleb said, his voice steady. "They are safe." The woman Inara did not respond immediately. She continued her silent assessment, her eyes flicking from his face to the cabin, to the mountains that cradled it. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod and began to walk forward. Nita burst from the cabin, crying out a single word in her own tongue, a word that sounded like both a name and a prayer. She ran to her mother, burying her face in the woman's dress. Inara's stoic expression softened as she wrapped her arms around her eldest daughter, stroking her hair, her movements full of a powerful, restrained love. She held Nita for a long moment before gently setting her aside. Her eyes then found Caleb's again. "You gave them water," she said. Her English was clear, precise, with only a trace of an accent. It was not a question. "And shelter. And medicine," Caleb replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. "The little one had a fever. It's passed." Inara walked past him and into the cabin. Caleb remained outside, giving them their space. He could hear the soft murmur of the Apache language, a sound of reunion and comfort. He heard Shima's weak but happy cry as she woke to find her mother there. He felt like an intruder in his own home, a stranger to the profound familial bond that filled the small space. After what felt like an hour, Inara emerged from the cabin. Nita and Shima followed, standing behind her, their fear visibly lessened in their mother's presence. Shima even offered Caleb a small, shy smile. Inara stopped in front of him. "I tracked them from the place of the attack. I found your trail. You walk like a man who knows the land, but you do not walk like a soldier." "I haven't been a soldier for a long time," Caleb said. "Why did you help them?" she asked, her voice sharp, direct. "The children of your enemies." Caleb's gaze drifted to the distant peaks. "They weren't my enemies. They were children. That's all I saw." It was the truth, or at least part of it. The other part, the part that lived in the dark recesses of his memory of another family he had failed to save, remained unspoken. But he felt as if Inara could see it anyway. Her eyes seemed to hold a deep, ancient wisdom, a knowledge of suffering and the complexities of the human heart. She studied him for another long moment, her expression unreadable. She seemed to come to a decision. "My people have little," she said, "but we pay our debts. A life for a life is a debt that cannot be repaid with blankets or food. But it must be acknowledged." Her gaze was intense, and Caleb felt a strange premonition, a sense that he was standing on the precipice of a decision that would change the course of his quiet life. The rescue was over, but he was beginning to realize that the real trouble had only just begun. The arrival of this powerful, watchful woman was not an ending, but a new and far more dangerous beginning. Inara reached into a small leather pouch that hung from her belt. Her movements were deliberate, imbued with a sense of ceremony that seemed to make the very air around them grow still. Nita and Shima watched their expressions solemn. Caleb stood his ground, a feeling of unease prickling the back of his neck. He had expected thanks, perhaps a promise of peace, but this felt different. This felt like a transaction, and he wanted no part of it. "I have nothing to offer you that you need," Inara stated, her voice resonating with a strange authority. "Your cabin is strong. You hunt well. You have medicine. A white man who lives like the mountain itself needs no silver, no beads." She paused, her dark eyes locking onto his. "But a debt is a debt. I will give you not what you want, but what has been given to me to protect. Now its protection falls to you." Before Caleb could protest, she drew her hand from the pouch. She held a small deerskin bundle, no bigger than his palm, tied shut with a leather thong. It was old, the leather worn smooth, with time and handling. The air around it seemed to shimmer with significance. It felt less like an object, and more like a vessel containing something of immense weight. "I don't want payment," Caleb said, his voice firm. "I did what was right." "What is right is a circle," Inara replied, her voice unwavering. "You saved my blood. I now place a burden in your hands. This is the way. To refuse the gift is to break the circle. It would bring dishonor to my family and bad medicine to this place." Her words hung in the air, a clear and unavoidable ultimatum. To refuse would be a grave insult, an act that would shatter the fragile trust being built. He saw Nita's eyes narrow, watching him, judging him. Reluctantly, Caleb held out his hand. Inara placed the small bundle in his palm. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and warm as if it held a residual heat from her own body. As his fingers closed around it, he felt a strange, almost electric tingle. His eyes met Inara's, and for a fleeting instant he saw not gratitude in her expression, but a profound sadness, a deep-seated worry. It was the look of someone passing on not a treasure, but a curse. "Keep it safe," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost carried away by the wind. "Keep it hidden. There are those who would kill for it. They killed my husband for it." The words struck Caleb like a physical blow. The attack on the children hadn't been random. It was targeted. They were hunting for this. "Who?" he asked, his voice tight. "A man of our own people, Kyle. He has a sickness in his heart, a lust for a power he does not understand. And he is not alone. He speaks with white men who have the same sickness." She looked at her daughters. "We must go. We are not safe here. Kyle will track us." "You're not safe out there either," Caleb argued. "Stay, you can have the cabin. I can watch the passers." Inara shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "You have done enough, Caleb Thorne. You have taken our trouble into your home. We will not bring the wolf to your door." She placed a hand on each of her daughters' shoulders. "We will go where he cannot find us, to the Spirit Mountains." She then turned, and without another word led her children away from the cabin. They moved with a fluid grace, melting into the landscape of rock and juniper, until they were gone, leaving Caleb standing alone in the morning sun, the mysterious bundle clutched in his hand. He returned to the silence of his cabin, but the silence was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the palpable presence of danger. He sat at his rough-hewn table and stared at the deerskin pouch. The weight of it felt immense. Her words echoed in his mind, "A burden in your hands." With hesitant fingers he untied the leather thong. The deerskin unfolded, revealing its contents. There was no gold, no precious stones. Inside lay a single object, a flat circular piece of obsidian polished to a mirror-like sheen. It was cool to the touch. Etched onto its surface was a complex and beautiful pattern of lines and dots, a celestial map. It was a perfect rendering of the night sky, but with certain stars and constellations connected by fine, deliberate lines. At the center of the map, where several lines converged, was a symbol he did not recognize, a spiral within a circle. He ran his thumb over the etchings. It was not a treasure map in any way he understood. It was something else, something far older and more mysterious. He held it up to the light from the window, and the polished surface seemed to absorb the light, the etched stars glimmering with an inner fire. What power did this hold that men would kill for it? And why, of all people, had Inara entrusted it to him? He was a man who had intentionally severed his ties to the world, who had sought a life of simplicity, free from the violent complexities of men. And now this small, dark stone had tethered him to a conflict he didn't understand, making him the guardian of a secret he couldn't fathom. His eyes drifted to the faded tintype on the mantelpiece. A young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. His wife lost to cholera years ago. Her death had been the first crack in his world. The second had come later during his final tour as an army scout. He closed his eyes, the memory rising unbidden, as sharp and painful as the day it happened. He'd been tracking a small band of Chiricahua, said to be hostile. His commanding officer, a pompous and cruel man named Major Harrison, was itching for a promotion. Caleb's report was clear. It was a family group, not warriors. A grandmother, 2 women, 3 children. They were gathering medicinal herbs in a sacred canyon. He advised leaving them be. Harrison had ignored him. He'd called Caleb a savage lover and ordered the attack at dawn. Caleb could still hear the screams, see the flash of gunfire in the pre-dawn gloom. He had tried to intervene to stop the slaughter, but he was thrown aside, his protests silenced by the butt of a rifle. He had watched helpless as the soldiers murdered them all. He'd resigned his commission the next day, turning his back on the army and the so-called civilized world, and retreated into the mountains, haunted by the faces of the family he had inadvertently led to their deaths. He opened his eyes, his gaze returning to the obsidian star chart. Inara's words about Kyle speaking with white men echoed in his mind. A cold dread began to seep into his bones. He had a sickening feeling he knew exactly what kind of white men would align themselves with a renegade to hunt down a family for a secret. Men like Major Harrison. Men driven by greed and a complete disregard for any life that stood in their way. He carefully rewrapped the obsidian disc and tucked it into a small metal box where he kept his few valuables. He then pushed the box into a hollow space he'd carved out behind a loose stone in his chimney. It was the most secure place in the cabin. As he sealed the stone back in place, he knew he was also sealing his fate. He was no longer a recluse, a neutral observer. He was a participant. He was the keeper of a dangerous secret, the guardian of a gift that felt more like a ticking bomb. The peace he had worked so hard to build had been shattered, and the ghosts of his past were stirring, whispering that this was his chance, not to run, but to finally make a stand. Miles away in a shadowed canyon, where the rocks bled red in the dying light, Kyle watched his tracker return. The man was old and wiry, his face a mask of grim failure. Kyle did not need to hear the words. He could see it in the man's posture. "They are gone," the tracker said, his voice a dry rasp. "The woman Inara, she is clever. She found the girls. Their tracks lead into the high country towards the white man's cabin. But from there, nothing. She knows how to hide a trail. It is like they became the wind." Kyle's eyes, as black and hard as the obsidian he craved, narrowed to slits. He was a man carved from the harshest realities of their changing world. He saw the old ways dying, his people starving on reservations, their power fading. He believed the old stories, the prophecies of a hidden place, the heart of the mountain, where the spirits had left a gift of immense power. The star chart passed down through Inara's bloodline was the key. With it, he believed he could unite the scattered bands, drive out the white man, and restore the Apache to their former glory. He saw himself as a savior, a visionary, but his vision was clouded by a brutal ambition that tolerated no dissent. "The white man!" Kyle snarled, his hand tightening on the hilt of his knife. She would go to an debut for help. The thought was an insult to his pride, a rejection of his own power. He had offered to protect Inara's family, to take Nita as his wife, and unite their bloodlines, to share the power of the heart of the mountain. Inara had refused. She had called his ambition a disease, and for that he had killed her husband and sworn to possess the chart and the girl one way or another. "He is a mountain man," the tracker added. "Lives alone. They say he was a scout for the pony soldiers but left them long ago. He knows the land as well as we do." Kyle's lip curled. No white man knows this land. He only borrows it. He turned to the half-dozen warriors who followed him, their faces grim and hungry. "We will find them. Inara will go to the spirit mountains, to the old places. We will watch the passes. But first, I will have a word with this mountain man." He imagined the white man soft from his cabin and his warm fire. He would be easy to break. Kyle would take the chart from his corpse. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the unforgiving landscape, a place where desperate men came to lose their money, their dignity, and sometimes their lives. It consisted of a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office, all leaning against each other, as if for support against the constant pressing wind. Caleb rode his steady buckskin mare down the main street, feeling the familiar weight of eyes upon him. The townsfolk viewed him with a mixture of fear and suspicion. He was a man of the mountains, a man who lived outside their rules, and that made him an unknown quantity, a potential danger. He ignored the whispers and the narrowed gazes tying his horse in front of the Redemption General Store. He needed supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and cartridges for his Winchester. But more than that, he needed information. He needed to hear the whispers on the wind to gauge the mood of the territory. Inara's words about white men working with Kyle had lit a fire of suspicion in his gut. The store was run by a portly, balding man named Henry Gable, who polished the counter with a nervous energy. "Caleb," he grunted by way of greeting. "Been a while. Thought maybe a mountain lion got you." "Not yet, Henry," Caleb replied, his voice flat. He handed over his list. As Henry gathered the items, the door swung open, and the man Caleb had hoped and dreaded to see strode in. Bartholomew Bart Higgins was a man who seemed too large and too loud for the small store. He was dressed in a fine, tailored suit that looked ridiculously out of place, a string tie tight around his thick neck. His face was florid, his eyes small and greedy. Higgins was a rancher, a land speculator, a man who had come west with a small fortune and was determined to turn it into a large one, no matter who he had to crush to do it. He owned the largest ranch in the area and held the mortgage on half the businesses in town, including Henry's store. "Thorne," Higgins boomed, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "Good to see you down from your perch. Still communing with the squirrels and savages, are we?" Two of his hired guns, rough-looking men with pistols tied low on their hips, flanked him, their faces set in permanent sneers. "Just getting supplies, Higgins," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. He despised Higgins. The man reminded him too much of Major Harrison. The same arrogance, the same casual cruelty, the same belief that the world was his for the taking. "I hear there's been some trouble up your way," Higgins said, leaning against the counter, trying to appear casual. "Some renegade Apache stirring up dust. My boys ran into a small band just the other day, near Whisper Creek. Had to persuade them to move along." Caleb's blood ran cold. Whisper Creek, the same place he had found the girls. He kept his face impassive, but his hand drifted closer to the pistol on his hip. "Persuade them?" Higgins chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Let's just say they won't be bothering my cattle any time soon. Pity. I heard they were sitting on something valuable. Some old tribal nonsense, a map to a silver mine, they say. You haven't stumbled across anything like that in your wanderings, have you, Thorn? A man could make a fortune." So that was it. Not just Cale. Higgins was hunting for it too. The silver mine was a lie, a cover for what he was really after, but the greed was real. Inara had said Cale spoke with white men. She had meant Higgins. The attack, the murder of her husband, it all led back to this bloated, smiling man in the dusty store. "The only thing of value in these mountains is the peace and quiet, Higgins." Caleb said, his voice like flint. "Something you seem determined to destroy." Higgins's smile vanished. "You watch your tone, Thorn. This is my valley. You're just squatting in it. A man who lives so close to the Apache might get mistaken for one." The threat was unmistakable. Caleb simply stared at him, his pale eyes burning with a cold fire. For a moment, the tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. Henry Gable looked like he was about to faint. The standoff was broken by the arrival of Sheriff Brody. The sheriff was a tall, weary man in his 50s, his face lined with the stress of trying to keep a lid on a powder keg of a town. He wasn't a bad man, but he was a pragmatic one, and he knew who paid the town's bills. "Bart Caleb," Brody said, his voice tired. "Let's keep it civil. What's the trouble?" "No trouble, Sheriff," Higgins said, straightening his suit. "Just a friendly chat. Thorn was just telling me how much he enjoys the peace and quiet." He gave Caleb one last, menacing look before turning and sweeping out of the store, his thugs in his wake. Sheriff Brody sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You need to be careful, Caleb. Higgins is not a man to cross. He's got the judge in his pocket, and enough hired guns to start a small war. He's the one causing the trouble, Brody," Caleb said, his voice low and intense. "He and his men attacked an Apache family near my claim. Women and children." Brody's eyes clouded with frustration. "I've heard the rumors, but I have no proof. No bodies, no witnesses who will talk. Higgins claims they were rustlers. It's his word against whispers. My hands are tied." Caleb paid for his supplies, his mind racing. His sanctuary was no longer a sanctuary. It was the center of a storm. Kyle was hunting the chart from one side, Higgins from the other. And he, Caleb Thorn, a man who wanted nothing to do with the world, was standing squarely in the middle, holding the very thing they were willing to kill for. As he loaded the supplies onto his mare, he knew he couldn't just ride back to his cabin and hide. Hiding was no longer an option. He had to prepare for a war he never wanted. The ride back to his cabin was fraught with a new kind of tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. Caleb pushed his mare hard, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. He was no longer just a man returning home. He was a courier, carrying a fragile secret through enemy territory. The conversation with Higgins had confirmed his worst fears. The landowner's casual mention of Whisper Creek was a boast, a clear admission of his role in the attack that had nearly killed Nita and Shima. The so-called silver mine was the lie they were telling to motivate their hired guns, a simple story of greed to cover a more complex and dangerous truth. He reached his cabin as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson. The place looked the same, solid, peaceful, a part of the mountain. But it felt different. It was no longer a refuge, it was a target. He unsaddled his horse, and before taking his supplies inside, conducted a thorough sweep of the area. He moved in a wide circle, his senses on high alert. He found what he was looking for near the spring that fed the creek, a single, almost invisible sign. A small, uniquely knotted piece of grass, an Apache trail marker. It was fresh. It told him two things. Someone had been here, and they wanted him to know they were not a threat. It was a sign of friendly passage. He relaxed slightly. Inara. She had circled back, checking on him, or perhaps watching the valley from the high ground. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. He was not entirely alone in this fight, but her presence also meant the danger was still close, circling them both. Inside the cabin he worked with grim purpose. He barred the heavy wooden door and shuttered the window. He checked his ammunition, laying out the cartridges on the table. He had 2 boxes for his Winchester, and nearly a full one for his Colt Peacemaker. It wasn't enough for a prolonged siege, but it would have to do. He cleaned both weapons with practiced efficiency, the familiar scent of gun oil, and the metallic click of the mechanisms a grim comfort. As darkness fell, a profound loneliness settled over him. He had chosen this life, this solitude, but now it felt like a vulnerability. He thought of Inara and her daughters, somewhere out in the vast, dark wilderness. He pictured Nita's defiant eyes and Shima's shy smile. He had only known them for a day, but their fate was now inextricably linked with his. The weight of the obsidian disk hidden behind the stone in his hearth felt like it was pressing down on his very soul. He was banking the fire for the night when he heard it, a sound so soft it was almost imperceptible. A single clear note like a bird call echoing from the rocks above his cabin. It was a signal. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, his heart pounding. The call came again. It wasn't the call of any night bird he knew. He unbarred the door and stepped out into the moonless night. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice low. A figure detached itself from the deep shadows of the pines. It was Inara. She moved toward him, a silent, ghostly presence in the dark. "I told you I would not bring the wolf to your door," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "But the wolf is already here." "Higgins," Caleb stated. She nodded, her face grim. "His riders have been scouting the canyons all day. They are clumsy and loud, but there are many of them. They search for something, and Cale is not far behind. I have seen his sign. He is like a hunting dog, patient and relentless. They are all closing on this place." "They think I have the chart," Caleb said. "They do not think." "They know," Inara corrected him. "Kyle saw your trail leading from the creek bed with my daughters. He is not a fool. He knows I would not leave them with an enemy. And Higgins has men who listen to the whispers in the town. They will have heard of the mountain man who brought 2 Apache children out of the wilderness. They will put the pieces together." A heavy silence fell between them. The night was alive with the chirping of crickets, but it felt like the quiet before a battle. "Why me, Inara?" Caleb finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Why give it to me? You're putting me in the middle of your war." Inara stepped closer, her gaze intense. "Because this is your war too, Caleb Thorne. You just did not know it until now." She raised a hand, her long fingers pointing toward the distant hazy lights of the Higgins ranch. The man who leads those riders. He has the same spirit as a man you once knew, a man in a blue coat, a man who left ghosts in a place called Canyon de Chelly. Caleb flinched as if she had struck him. He had never told anyone his story, had never spoken the name of that place aloud. How could she possibly know? My sister was in that canyon, Wenara said softly, her voice filled with an ancient sorrow. She and her family. She was a healer. She was gathering roots when the soldiers came. A scout had led them there. The world seemed to tilt under Caleb's feet. The ghosts he had been running from had just walked out of the darkness and stood before him, the family he had failed to save. They were her kin. The crushing weight of his past came crashing down on him, the guilt as fresh and raw as it was years ago. I tried to stop them, he whispered, his voice hoarse with a shame that had festered for a decade. I swear to you I tried. I know, Wenara said, her voice softening with an unexpected compassion. My sister's spirit told me. She saw the heart of the scout who wept for them. I did not know it was you until I looked into your eyes when you stood over my children. I saw the same shadow, the same regret. The Great Spirit does not work in straight lines, Caleb. It creates circles. You could not save my sister's children, but you saved mine. The circle is not yet closed. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. That stone, she said, nodding toward the cabin. It does not lead to silver. It leads to the heart of the mountain, a hidden spring deep within a cave system. The water there has unique properties. It can heal the sick. The ground around it is rich with minerals the railroad men would kill for. To my people, it is a sacred place of life. To men like Higgins, it is only money. To a man like Cale, it is a weapon. In the wrong hands, it would bring an army of prospectors and soldiers that would destroy what is left of my people and this land forever. Everything clicked into place. The greed, the desperation, the convergence of these two ruthless forces on his small, isolated cabin. Wenara hadn't just given him a gift, she had given him a chance at redemption. She had seen the ghost of his failure and offered him a path to finally face it. They will come at dawn, Wenara said, her voice pulling him from his reverie. Higgins from the valley, Cale from the high pass. They will try to crush you between them. Caleb looked at her, the despair and guilt in his eyes slowly being replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was a guardian. He was a part of the circle. No, Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. They will not crush me. This is my mountain, and they are not welcome here. The convergence of shadows was coming, but he would be ready. He would turn his fortress of solitude into a fortress of war. The darkness before dawn was thick with predatory tension. Inside his cabin, Caleb Thorne waited, his Winchester rifle resting on an overturned table. He watched as Higgins's men, at least 10 of them, advanced with the sloppy confidence of bullies. Caleb let them get close, then shattered the morning silence with a single expert shot, dropping their leader. The hired guns scrambled for cover, returning a wild volley of fire that thudded harmlessly against the log walls. Anticipating their next move, Caleb had prepared a trap. As a group of thugs tried to flank him by way of a steep, rocky slope, he pulled a rope that sent a massive log crashing down on them. The thunderous roar and screams of pain effectively closed off that route of attack. While Higgins's men were reeling, a new threat emerged. A chilling war cry echoed from the high pass behind the cabin. It was Kyle and his warriors descending like mountain cats. Caleb was caught in a pincer. He fired at Higgins's men to keep them pinned, while arrows from Cale's warriors began striking his cabin. Suddenly, a new element of chaos erupted fire. Inara, moving like a phantom, had set the dry canyon brush ablaze, cutting off the hired gun's line of retreat. Panicked and trapped between the flames and two sources of gunfire, the fragile alliance of greed shattered. Kyle, seeing the white men as a liability, ordered his warriors to attack them. The siege devolved into a chaotic three-way battle. As Higgins's men broke and fled, Cale and his remaining warriors charged the cabin, their sole focus now on the prize within. Caleb dropped two more with his rifle before switching to his Colt as they crashed through his window and door, the small cabin filled with the deafening roar of the pistol and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Caleb was down to his last bullet when Kyle himself filled the shattered doorway, a figure of pure rage. Before either man could act, a movement flickered behind the renegade. It was Nita lunging forward with a small knife, which she plunged into Kyle's thigh. Kyle roared in pain, swatting her away, but her brave act gave Caleb the 1 second he needed. He raised his Colt, his aim steady, and fired. The shot struck Kyle in the chest, and the warrior collapsed, ending the siege as abruptly as it began. The aftermath of the battle was a surreal scene of smoke and silence. Caleb stepped out of his ruined cabin, the ringing in his ears slowly fading. Kyle lay motionless on the porch, his terror ended. Down the canyon, the last of Higgins's men were fleeing the fire Inara had expertly set to break their attack. Caleb's first thought was for Nita. He rushed to her side, finding her bruised but safe, her eyes filled with a fierce, defiant pride. She had faced her father's murderer and had not flinched. Inara appeared from the smoke, embracing her daughter, before her gaze met Caleb's, conveying a universe of sorrow, relief, and profound respect. As the morning wore on, they tended to the grim, necessary task of burying the dead. By noon, a small posse, led by Sheriff Brody, arrived, drawn by the smoke. His face was a mask of grim determination. "We ran into a couple of Higgins's men," Brody said, his voice raspy. "They were babbling about a massacre. Said you started it." "They started it a few days ago," Caleb replied flatly, "when they killed Inara's husband and left her daughters for dead." Inara stepped forward, her presence commanding. She told Brody everything of Cale's ambition, Higgins's greed, and their unholy alliance to seize the sacred land for profit. Her story was corroborated by a rancher in Brody's posse, whose son had recently quit working for Higgins, disgusted by the landowner's plot to wipe out the local Apache. The whispers had finally become testimony. "Bartholomew Higgins is a cancer on this valley," Brody declared, his voice hard as iron, "and it's time to cut it out." He dispatched his deputy to town to gather men and issue a warrant for murder. As the sheriff rode off to dispense justice, a quiet peace settled over the canyon. Caleb looked at his bullet-scarred cabin. It was wounded, but still standing much like himself. The ghosts of his past were finally quiet, not vanquished by violence, but by the choice to stand and protect. The circle was complete. Inara approached him, her daughters behind her. "You have bled for my family, Caleb Thorne. The debt is now mine." Caleb shook his head. "There is no debt. This was my fight too." He looked at the mountains, his home. It was no longer a fortress of solitude. "I'll rebuild," he said simply. A knowing smile touched Inara's lips. "You are welcome in our lands always. You are no longer a stranger. You are Zillicheandi, the Red Mountain Man, a friend to the people." As he watched them disappear back into the landscape, Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known in years. A new dawn was breaking over the Dragoon Mountains, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face the light. And so the story of Caleb Thorne, the mountain man who sought only solitude but found redemption, comes to a close. His tale reminds us that the Wild West wasn't just a place of gunslingers and gold rushes, but of profound human connections forged in the crucible of hardship. It shows us that true strength isn't found in isolation, but in the courage to stand for others, and that sometimes the heaviest burdens become the most profound gifts. Caleb's cabin was rebuilt, its scarred logs a testament to the battle he fought, not just for the Apache sisters, but for his own soul. The heart of the mountain remained a secret, a sacred trust protected by the quiet guardian of Whisper Creek. If this journey into the heart of the Old West moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with others who appreciate tales of courage and honor, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories from the forgotten corners of history. What did you think of Caleb's choice? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.